My parents told me my brother's award mattered more than my promotion ceremony, so I finally stopped pretending our family wasn't broken. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Lena Caro. I'm 26, living in Ohio, and I work at an architecture firm. Since I was a kid, my parents made it clear that my older brother, Brant, was the star of the family. No matter what I did, they always found a way to downplay it. When I won a state art contest, they left early. When Brant passed a basic class, they threw a barbecue. I learned to live in his shadow, but part of me always hoped they would notice me someday. When I earned a big promotion, I thought that moment had finally come. It wasn't just a title. It was years of long nights, hard work, and proving myself. I invited my parents, thinking maybe they'd be proud. But the night before the ceremony, they called. Brant was getting a small local award, and they said they couldn't be in two places at once and that his event was more important. Hearing that shattered something inside me. During my ceremony, everyone clapped, but all I could see were the empty chairs I saved for them. I realized I was done begging for their attention. It hurt, but it also opened my eyes. I deserved better than being treated like an afterthought. That moment became the start of me standing up for myself, even if it meant leaving behind the people who should have loved me the most. Growing up in the Caro household taught me one lesson early: some people get praised for breathing, and some have to move mountains just to be noticed. I learned which group I belonged to before I even understood the meaning of favoritism. Brant never needed to try. If he brought home a worksheet stamped with a simple good effort, my parents acted like he'd solved something impossible. They'd smile, clap, and treat him to his favorite meal as if he'd climbed a peak no one else could reach. I worked hard at everything I touched. I stayed after school, practiced, pushed myself, and hoped that maybe effort mattered. One year, after months of sketching and revising, I entered a statewide art contest. When the results came in, I could barely breathe. I had placed first. My teacher hugged me. My classmates cheered. My parents showed up just long enough to nod, snap one picture, and say they needed to leave early because traffic gets bad around this time. I stood there alone, holding my ribbon, watching other families stay until the very end. Their kids laughed and posed while mine hurried toward the exit. Later that week, Brant brought home a report card sprinkled with B's and C's. Nothing special, nothing surprising. But that evening, the table filled with his favorite dishes. The whole night became a celebration of how well he had done. No one mentioned my award. My ribbon sat on the counter until it disappeared, probably tossed out with the grocery bags. Moments like that repeated themselves so often they blended together, each one carving a little deeper into me. I kept hoping for a day when someone would clap for me the way they clapped for him. That day never came. The months leading up to that promotion nearly drained everything I had. I stayed long after the office lights dimmed, revising plans, fixing small errors, and shaping ideas until they matched the vision in my head. I worked weekends, skipped outings, and pushed past exhaustion because I wanted to prove I could handle something bigger. When the firm finally announced I'd been chosen to lead a new urban redevelopment project, my chest felt tight in the best way. It wasn't just a title or a raise. It felt like someone finally saw the value I poured into my work. My boss called me into his office, shook my hand, and said they'd be hosting a small ceremony to introduce the project lead to everyone involved. Hearing those words made my stomach flip. I pictured standing there with people clapping, not because they had to, but because they believed in me. And for a moment, I let myself imagine my parents being part of that. Maybe they would sit in the audience, smiling at me the way they always did for Brant. I tried to talk myself out of inviting them. Past experiences told me exactly how things usually went. Still, something hopeful kept whispering that this time might be different. This milestone carried weight. It wasn't a school competition or some after-hours event. It was my career, my hard work finally getting recognition. So I called them. My voice shook a little as I explained the ceremony and what the promotion meant to me. I asked if they could come even though the event wasn't grand or fancy. I didn't want gifts or speeches. I just wanted them to be there and see what I had built for myself. When they agreed, a small part of me dared to believe they meant it. I didn't know yet that hope would hurt worse than anything else. The night before the ceremony, my phone rang while I was laying out the clothes I planned to wear. I answered expecting something simple, maybe a question about directions or the time. Instead, I heard my mother clear her throat in that familiar way she used when preparing to deliver news I wouldn't like. She told me they wouldn't be able to make it after all. My father spoke up in the background, explaining that Brant had been chosen to receive a community leadership award at a nearby lodge. It wasn't a major event, just a small gathering hosted by a group he occasionally volunteered with. But to them, it suddenly became an occasion they couldn't miss. I stood there gripping the phone, staring at the outfit I'd ironed, the notes I'd written, the tiny spark of excitement I'd allowed myself to feel. They kept talking, trying to soften it by saying Brant's recognition was a big moment for him and that my ceremony was just work. That phrase hit harder than anything. They dismissed something that represented years of effort as if it were nothing more than a dull obligation. My stomach twisted. I'd prepared myself for disappointment, but not like this. I thought maybe they'd have a scheduling conflict or feel tired. But hearing them compare my milestone to a casual lodge gathering made the air feel heavy around me. I tried to respond without my voice breaking, but the hurt was too sharp. After hanging up, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the quiet room. The excitement I had felt earlier drained out of me, leaving only a cold ache behind. This was supposed to be a moment I shared with them. Instead, it became another reminder of where I ranked in their world. The next afternoon, I walked into the firm's event space trying to steady my breathing. People were gathering, adjusting their name tags, chatting about the project announcement. I kept telling myself to stay focused, to push aside the knot sitting in my chest. Still, my eyes wandered to the 2 chairs I'd set aside near the front. I had asked the coordinator to place them there because I wanted my parents to have a clear view. Now they sat untouched, perfectly straight, almost accusing. When my name was called, the room filled with applause. My coworkers smiled, some even whistled, and my boss clapped me on the shoulder as he talked about my dedication and the confidence they had in me. Normally, I would have felt proud. Instead, it felt like the sound bounced right off me. Every cheer only reminded me of the silence from the people who should have been there without needing to be asked. As I stepped up to speak, I caught sight of those empty seats again. A wave of something sharp and final hit me. It wasn't anger, not really. It was the sudden understanding that nothing I did would ever shift the scale at home. I had spent years twisting myself into someone who hoped a little harder, worked a little more, tried to be impossible levels of good, all for a small sign that I mattered. And standing there, with a whole room supporting me except the 2 people I'd wanted most, the last thread snapped. I finished my speech, shook hands, smiled when expected, but inside something changed. I wasn't going to chase what they refused to give. I wasn't going to wait for recognition that never came. In that moment, I felt a strange, quiet freedom settle over me. I was finally done begging. When the crowd finally thinned and the last handshake ended, I slipped away to a quiet corner near the refreshment table. I didn't want to go home yet. I needed a moment to breathe, to let everything settle. While I was standing there pretending to look over a stack of brochures, Marin, one of the senior architects, approached me. She'd always been calm, steady, the kind of person who noticed things others overlooked. She handed me a small glass of sparkling water and stood beside me without saying anything at first. Then she glanced toward the space where those 2 empty chairs had been. Her voice was low when she finally spoke. "I've never seen your folks at anything we've hosted for you," she said gently, not accusing, just observant. "I hope you know that the people who care about you make the effort. That's what counts." I didn't answer right away. I felt something tighten in my chest because her words weren't dramatic or emotional, they were simply true. She wasn't trying to comfort me with sweet lines. She was giving me reality, plain and honest. It landed deeper than I expected. She continued, "Family can be wonderful, but it can also be complicated. What matters is who chooses to stand beside you, not who shares your last name. That sentence hit me harder than anything I'd heard all day. Maybe because it came from someone who had no reason to say it except kindness. Maybe because I'd been pretending for so long that my parents' absence didn't bother me. Hearing it put into simple terms made something inside me shift. I looked at Marin, and she gave me the kind of smile that says, "I'd been there." In that small moment, I felt seen in a way I wasn't used to. It didn't fix everything, but it sparked the thought that maybe I didn't have to keep accepting so little. The house was quiet when I walked in, but the moment I stepped into the living room, my parents' voices filled the space. They weren't talking about anything I'd done that day. They were busy retelling every detail of Brant's lodge ceremony, describing who shook his hand, what dessert they served, and how everyone there could tell he's going places. They didn't even notice I still had my event badge clipped to my jacket. I sat down, hoping they might ask how things had gone, but the conversation never shifted. My father replayed Brant's acceptance speech like it was the highlight of the year, and my mother kept saying how proud she felt watching him stand at the podium. I waited, thinking they might turn to me eventually. They didn't. Finally, I tried to speak. I told them my presentation had gone well and that the firm seemed excited about the direction of the project. I barely finished one sentence before my mother waved her hand, brushing it off like it was background noise. "Don't be dramatic, Lena," she said, not even looking up from the photos she was scrolling through. "You know how special your brother is. His night was important." The words hit with a sharpness I wasn't prepared for. It wasn't just what she said, it was the tone, the certainty, the expectation that I would fall back into silence the way I always had. I could feel the sting spreading through my chest, heavier with every second. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just sat there, listening to them celebrate someone who didn't even realize how much space he took up. Every laugh and compliment they gave him made the room feel colder. That was the moment the betrayal settled deep, not loud or explosive, but icy and final. That night, after listening to them praise Brant until my head felt numb, I went to my room without saying much. I closed the door and sat on the edge of my bed, letting the silence settle around me. Something inside had shifted for good. I didn't feel anger boiling or tears pushing forward. It was quieter than that, an understanding that nothing I did would ever change the way things were. I had spent years hoping for a version of us that didn't exist. I opened my laptop and began taking small steps, the kind that didn't attract attention but slowly built a path out. I moved part of my savings into an account only I could access. I'd been careful with my money, and now that caution finally meant something. Next, I started browsing listings for places within driving distance of my job. I wanted somewhere simple, somewhere that felt like mine, even if it was only a tiny apartment with creaky floors and mismatched cabinets. Each listing I clicked made me breathe a little easier. I wasn't running away, I was choosing something different for myself. I also went through old messages and reminders, deleting anything that pulled me back into the habit of trying too hard. I didn't want to keep chasing approval that never came. Over the next few days, I spoke less at home. Not to punish anyone, but because I didn't have energy left for conversations that left me empty. I woke up early, left for work before sunrise, and stayed out until late evening. Creating distance felt like peeling off heavy layers I'd been carrying for years. With every small change, I felt myself becoming lighter. I realized I no longer needed a seat at a table where I had never been welcome. I was finally ready to build a life where I wasn't an afterthought. About a month after I started putting distance between myself and my parents, my firm gathered everyone for a briefing on a new contract. The atmosphere felt charged, the kind of energy that filled a room when something big was about to be announced. When the partners revealed we had secured the job to redesign the Lakeside district, I straightened in my seat. That area was familiar, too familiar. My parents' small shop sat right in the middle of it. As the presentation continued, the details became clearer. The redevelopment plan involved purchasing several privately owned properties to make space for new public spaces, storefronts, and residential units. It wasn't a demolition project, but it meant negotiating fair buyouts with every owner in the district. The firm needed someone to handle the early consultations, someone who could balance professionalism with empathy. My manager looked directly at me when he said my name. I felt the weight of the assignment settle on my shoulders. This wasn't just another responsibility. I knew every street corner in that district. I'd spent summers sweeping the front steps of my parents' store, folding postcards, helping tourists find local spots. That place carried pieces of my childhood, both the warm memories and the ones that stung. As the meeting ended and people began discussing timelines, I sat quietly, absorbing the strange twist of fate. I hadn't sought anything like this. I hadn't planned for it or wished for it. But there it was, an opportunity dropped in my lap, one that put me in a position I'd never expected to hold. It wasn't about payback, not then. It was about realizing I would soon stand on the opposite side of a table from the two people who had spent years dismissing everything I accomplished. For the first time, the balance felt different. A few weeks into the project, I received a call from my mother. She sounded flustered, a tone I hadn't heard directed at me in years. My father was in the background, speaking over her, insisting that I handle their property carefully. They wanted me to ensure the buyout offer was generous and that nothing threatened what they called the family legacy. Their words dripped with urgency, the kind of pleading reserved for moments when they realized their own influence wasn't enough. I listened quietly, letting them speak, noting every hesitation and over-explanation. It struck me how differently they treated me now, how much attention they lavished on my opinions only when they served their own needs. All the years of neglect, the indifference, the missed celebrations, flashed through my mind. They hadn't wanted me before, not to share in milestones, not to notice me, not even to be proud. They wanted me because I held something they couldn't control themselves. When they finally paused, I responded calmly, outlining the same policies I applied to every property owner. I didn't bend rules or offer exceptions. My voice was steady, deliberate, and unyielding. The urgency in their tones faltered as they realized their pleas had no more power over me than a whisper in the wind. For the first time, I understood the truth fully: they had never truly needed me as a daughter. They had only needed a tool, a convenient ally when it benefited them. That realization didn't make me bitter. Instead, it felt freeing. I wasn't angry, I was untethered. They had finally revealed their true priorities, and I no longer had to be part of the story unless I chose to be. In that moment, the balance shifted entirely, and I held the weight of control for the first time in our lives. When the negotiations began, I approached every property owner with the same rules, the same expectations, the same fairness. I listened to their concerns, considered their needs, and offered solutions that balanced the company's goals with respect for their homes. Nothing was altered for my parents, no shortcuts or special perks slipped in under the table. I followed the procedures exactly as they applied to everyone else. My parents watched each meeting closely, their faces tight with disbelief. They had expected me to manipulate the numbers, to sway decisions in their favor because they had always assumed I would. They didn't account for the fact that I had learned long ago how it felt to be dismissed, overlooked, and undervalued. They didn't realize I had carried that lesson into this moment, and now it guided every choice I made. When the final offers were presented, my parents read through the documents carefully. The figures were fair, equitable, reasonable, and above all, impartial. They weren't the bonuses they had imagined, and I could see the disappointment flicker across their expressions. They whispered to each other, incredulous that I hadn't bent the rules, hadn't favored them, hadn't made it easy. For the first time in my life, I had prioritized myself over their expectations. I wasn't trying to punish them, I wasn't seeking revenge through sabotage. I simply chose to act with integrity and for my own peace of mind. Their sense of betrayal was almost satisfying, though I didn't feel glee. I felt clarity and control, a quiet confirmation that I could make decisions without being swayed by the old patterns that had kept me small for so many years. Finally, I understood what it meant to hold my own power and use it wisely. A few nights later, they invited me to dinner, though I had no real desire to go. The house smelled the same, but the atmosphere was tense, charged in a way that made my chest tighten. As soon as I sat down, my parents began talking over one another, their voices rising with frustration. My father accused me of betraying the family and my mother called me ungrateful, each word like a dart meant to provoke guilt. For a long moment, I stayed quiet, letting them spill their anger, the familiar weight of blame pressing against my ribs. Then something inside me broke free. I stood up, my hands trembling slightly, and finally spoke, letting every carefully stored thought pour out. "You never chose me," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "Not once. All my life, I've tried to be someone worthy of your attention, someone you could notice, someone you could be proud of. And every time, you picked Brant." I took a breath, feeling the silence thicken around me. Their mouths opened, but no words came that could undo what had just been said. I continued, my voice steadier now, carrying the weight of years of being overlooked. "I'm done trying to earn a love you only give to him. I've spent too long bending myself into what you wanted, and I see now that you don't even want me." The room felt smaller suddenly, every accusation they had hurled now turned inward, bouncing off walls that I had once let trap me. I didn't yell, I didn't cry. I simply let the truth out, pure and unshielded. And in that moment, I felt the last layer of restraint peel away. I was no longer the girl waiting for approval, I was finally speaking for myself. The morning after that dinner, I packed a small bag and left without a word. The streets felt quieter than usual as I drove, the city waking slowly around me, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the pull of needing anyone's approval. Every turn I made, every mile I put between myself and that house, felt like shedding an old skin I hadn't realized weighed me down so much. Settling into my new apartment, I began building a routine that belonged entirely to me. I cooked my own meals, arranged my furniture exactly how I wanted, and finally allowed myself to breathe in spaces that weren't layered with old expectations. Neighbors waved as I walked down the hallway, offering small smiles that made me feel acknowledged, and slowly those little gestures began to matter more than any empty praise I had ever chased. At work, I leaned into connections I had neglected before. Marin checked in more frequently, offering guidance without condescension, and other colleagues began including me in projects in ways that felt genuinely respectful. For the first time, I experienced the difference between being useful to someone and being valued for who I was. Evenings became moments of quiet reflection rather than anxiety. I read, sketched, and walked along streets that no longer carried shadows from the past. Each day, I noticed how much lighter I felt without the constant pressure to prove myself to people who never wanted to see me. Over time, my life filled with those who genuinely cared, and the space I had left behind no longer haunted me. I realized that the home I had left behind had never held me, but now, surrounded by people who actually mattered, I had finally found a place where I belonged.
Months after the last meeting with my parents, I returned to the Lakeside District to see the project completed. The space had been transformed into a lively stretch of shops, walkways, and open areas filled with families and visitors. Sunlight danced off the water, reflecting against the new facades, and I couldn't help but notice how vibrant it felt. My parents' old shop stood in the midst of it all, now part of a design they had once dismissed as too modern or unnecessary. I walked along the boardwalk, observing the benches, the fountains, and the small plazas that I had envisioned and meticulously overseen. There was a subtle satisfaction in seeing the transformation, not because I wanted to humiliate anyone, but because I had created something lasting, something meaningful. Every corner reflected the care, patience, and dedication I had poured into the work, qualities my parents had never recognized in me. I paused near the area that used to be their property, taking in how the space had become a hub of life and movement. Children ran around, people laughed, and the designs I had fought to uphold were now celebrated by everyone who experienced them. For a moment, I let myself smile, not from malice, not from revenge in the traditional sense, but from the quiet realization that I had finally stepped into a place where my decisions carried weight and my efforts mattered. Their approval was no longer necessary. I didn't need them to validate my work or my worth. The peacefulness settled over me like a warm breeze. The life I had built, the respect I had earned, and the integrity I had maintained were my true triumphs. This was my revenge, not destruction, but freedom and fulfillment, proving that the only approval I needed had always been my own.